You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast's Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations with inspiring female scientists who study wolves. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. In this series, we travel from the temperate forests of coastal British Columbia to the Canadian Arctic, through the rugged Rocky Mountains of Western North America, and across the ocean to the European continent. From the 1970s to present day, we explore the remarkable return and recovery of gray wolves across the Northern Hemisphere, while also delving into their behavior, ecology, and intricate social dynamics. So thanks for joining us as we celebrate some of the women at the forefront of wolf research and conservation. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and we look forward to expanding the series in the future to feature a diverse range of voices, perspectives, and ways of knowing. So let's dive in. Today I'm excited to be joined by legendary wolf researcher Diane Boyd. Welcome, Diane.
Thanks. Glad to be here, Chelsea. I'm Diane Boyd, and I started working with wolves back in Minnesota in 1976 with Dave Mech, and I moved to the Rocky Mountains in 79 when there was one known wolf that was in the West, and I got the privilege also of working with Paul Paquette up in the Rocky Mountain Parks. I just recently published my first memoir, just released 2 months ago. So I've been very, very busy with that too.
Yeah, so your book is called A Woman Among Wolves, My Journey Through 40 Years of Wolf Recovery. Why did you write the book?
First of all, it's a story that has not been told. Hundreds of books have been written about the Yellowstone wolves. Nobody's written a good book or a story about the recovery of wolves walking down from the Canadian Rockies into the U.S. without fanfare, without funding, without anybody carrying crates and the presidential blessings. They just kind of did it. It's a very different story, and they naturally recolonized here 15 years before the Yellowstone reintroductions. And in addition to that, it happened a long time ago, started in 79, and many of the people who were instrumental in this studying this budding wolf population are now dead. I'm sort of the last one standing, and I feel it's a really important story. And thirdly, I hope through good storytelling and making science accessible, not overwhelming, to open minds a bit about wolves for the general public. So if you hate wolves or you love wolves or you don't care about wolves, you could pick up this book and take something away from it. I'm not preachy. I don't tell people what they should think. I tell the stories and let the reader think of their own conclusions.
Yeah, I've finished reading the book. As I told you before, I got to read it while I was in the field, which was also a very cool experience. And I definitely appreciated how you wrote it from a very centered perspective, where you're letting the reader, you're sharing the experiences and the stories and really letting them decide for themselves what they feel about wolves and the situation of wolves in North America. So I would definitely recommend it. It's a really easy read as well, which I appreciated.
Yeah, and it's small. And I know when I started out, I've done so much academic writing. I worked at the university, and it was hard. They told me you cannot put any literature cited in the text. You can't put footnotes on. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wow, I've taken away a lot of my typical tools, and I had to learn how to write from the heart. And I really enjoyed the process.
So I'm going to back up a little bit to the beginning. Why wolves? What led you to study wolves?
Well, I grew up in Minnesota, which was the only state in the lower 48 that had wolves then, with the exception of a handful in Isle Royale and maybe 5 in Wisconsin. So we had wolf exposure, but they were very, very shy and basically restricted only to the northern third of the state or fourth in the Boundary Water Canoe area. And people didn't see them a lot, or not, in a little south of that. But they were part of the ecosystem there, and I just became engaged with them. There's something in my DNA, and I've always been passionate about dogs and wolves, and I ended up pestering Dave Mech when I was a budding, aspiring biologist student on campus. His office was on my campus in St. Paul, University of Minnesota. And eventually I just kept persisting And he finally invited me to join some of their volunteer research work, and that started me down this path. It's just a consuming passion, I guess I'd have to say.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about your experience with David Mech? And you worked, it was in Minnesota in a captive facility, is that right?
He had a graduate student named Jane Packard. They were doing wolf studies outside of the Twin Cities, about 30 miles outside, at a place that back then we called Carlos Avery. Now it's called the Wildlife Science Center, I think. And she was studying reproductive ecology, doing hormone testing in relation to the status of the pack and who got bred, and combining visual observations with what we could see from the blood draws, hormonal injections, or responses to them, and knowing the status of the animal, so forth and so on. And it was pretty exciting times for a 19, 20-year-old college student to get in on this ground-shattering research, and got to handle wolves, even though it was captive. And then from that, I moved on and began doing wild wolf research in northern Minnesota.
And what did that entail? I know it was back in the 70s or so. So what did it mean to study a wild wolf?
So it was the summer of 1977. I went up to the Quishwe lab. It was a home to many future astounding biologists, researchers. I was lucky. I had a free intern. I just had an internship. It wasn't paid, to go up and assist with wolf capturing and collaring and surveying and flying and learning how to do telemetry and working with other biologists a little bit on other projects, bears, deer, ravens, snowshoe hare. So I got to whet my appetite and my feet often up there and learn about the rigors of field biology. And once I did that, I knew that was my calling. I'd been enrolled in pre-veterinary medicine at school. I wanted to be a veterinarian since I was a little kid. And once I got up in the North Country with wolves, I changed my career path.
Given your interest in vet medicine, did you see somewhat of an overlap in the field? I'm thinking, especially given the techniques that were being used with trapping and collaring wolves, I imagine some of that knowledge translated to your work on the ground.
Well, I grew up in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis. And so for me, a veterinarian was somebody who, cuts dog toenails and spays cats. I had no idea that there was a field for wildlife veterinarians and amazing research that would come using that as a tool. But back in 1973, 74, when I was in my first year of university, I didn't know that. And so I had worked for a vet for a year and basically decided that was not my calling. I wanted to be immersed in the wild world, and I was always curious. I wanted to learn. My favorite part of working at the vet clinic was when they were shorthanded. I got to assist with the surgeries, and they'd open up an animal. It's like, wow, there's the entire animal. Its whole inside, all its organs. It's living, it's moving, it's pulsing, and this animal is sleeping. And how does this connect with that? What's the function of that? Why does that have fat globules on it and that doesn't? I mean, I'm just a curious person. I did do some veterinary sort of first aid care of the wolves we caught, but nothing to the level that I did later in my career. And, as my wildlife veterinarian's friend do now.
So your first kind of assignment was tracking an individual wolf. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
So I worked up in northern Minnesota first in summer of 79 as a depredation control trapper for the federal government and a research trapper for Steve Fritz's postdoc work. And then I came to Montana at the end of that summer in 79, pursuing a master's degree with one wolf in the West who had been collared in British Columbia, just north of Glacier Park. It'd be basically south of Fernie, BC. And once in a while, she tiptoed into Montana and Glacier Park, but most of her home range was in British Columbia. And she was the only wolf collared, the first and only wolf collared west of Minnesota, basically. And there were other wolves occasionally making it down from Canada and filtering around, and they'd be shot or run over or herd, but they didn't stick, so to speak. She did, and she made it. And so, my first couple of years here, I spent a lot of time trying to catch and collar other wolves, and I was unable to because they weren't there. And then I got to be present when the population grew. I never dreamed that they would be so successful. It was really amazing.
Yeah, so that was way before Yellowstone. Hey, listeners. If you aren't familiar with the story of wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone National Park, the program began in 1995 when 14 gray wolves were captured in Canada and relocated to Yellowstone's Lamar Valley. By the end of 1997, a total of 41 wolves were relocated to the park. Prior to reintroduction and starting in the early 1900s, wolves in the Rocky Mountain region faced a tumultuous cycle of extirpation efforts, and their absence had left a noticeable void in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Although the program was not without controversy, the return of wolves to Yellowstone has had its significant ecological effects and has become a symbol of restoration ecology. With its many wide-open expanses and teams of dedicated park scientists, naturalists, and full-time wolf watchers, Yellowstone has also been deemed the best place in the world to watch and study wolves. I mean, thinking about reintroduction efforts like Yellowstone that have gotten a lot of, there's so many books that have been written about it, so many stories being told from that. You were documenting this natural recolonization, and I guess, how do those reintroduction efforts differ from natural recolonization in terms of approach and scale and timing of events?
That is one of my favorite subjects to discuss. So I am a firm believer in the resiliency of wolves. They're amazing survivors. We saw this population recolonize on its own, unaided. And by the time the wolves were introduced to Yellowstone and Idaho, we had about 75 wolves up in northwest Montana and at least 8 packs and a few loners wandering around long before those wolves were released. And I still to this day believe that wolves would have gotten there on their own without the aid of reintroduction. And my colleagues and I, we have friendly debates about this. Some believe that and some don't. But the fact is they were already getting to Yellowstone, and 2 wolves had been documented in the Yellowstone area in the early 90s before the reintroductions. One was shot just south of Yellowstone Park, and one was filmed by a professional filmmaker in the Hayden Valley inside Yellowstone. So they were getting there, and some of our wolves from Montana were going to Idaho. So the advantages and disadvantages of reintroduction versus natural recolonization, the biggest advantage of reintroduction is you jumpstart it more quickly. So if they hadn't reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, I believe in that 30 years time, we'd be at where we are now. But the first packs to get there might not have been in 95. It might have been in 2000. Once wolves hit critical mass, they're pretty effective recolonizers if they're not trapped, shot, and poisoned. And I can list people who agree with that and disagree with that, but it's just a matter of time. It's just like wolves getting to Colorado. They were already getting there and reproducing in 2020 before they decided to reintroduce them. And there's never, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been a reintroduction program of wolves in Canada. Is that true?
I don't believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're spreading everywhere. And same with Western Europe. They went from a handful of wolves in some of the Mediterranean and Eastern European states, and now they've filled Western Europe without any reintroductions. And so I just say they're clever, resilient, and survivors, and I really believe that reintroductions are unnecessary. That's my belief, but we'll never know because we can't set the clock back. We can't go backwards.
Yeah. And at that time, were they listed on the Endangered Species Act? Because talking about, they can recolonize if they don't have that imminent threat of hunting, trapping, poisoning, and all of that. Were they listed by then?
So they were listed by 74 in the Western U.S., and all wolves that appeared were considered native, and fully protected under the ESA, the Endangered Species Act. When animals are reintroduced, whether it's lynx or wolves, they have a different status. They're classified as a non-essential experimental population, and they're no longer fully endangered. So with that classification of non-essential experimental, they're allowed to be killed or taken as needed for management purposes. And so they lose the endangered status. that's another reason. So if they were still fully endangered and had gotten down there on their own, they would still be protected and they would still be killed illegally, no doubt. But I believe enough would get through that they would be there on their own with a lot less social rejections and ramifications. So the positive thing for reintroduction is it's a temporal issue. It's time. You speed it up. But the negative point, in my viewpoint, of reintroduction is that you force these wolves upon Western populations of humans that a lot of people don't want them there. If they'd have walked there on their own, I really believe they would have been more accepted, kind of like in Northwest Montana. It wasn't a big deal. Wolves showed up. It was novel. Once in a while, they kill a cow. They're dealt with. But dumping wolves out against people's will, Colorado's classic example of that right now. We're watching that unfold. What a mess. And nobody wins. Not the people who love the wolves, not the people who hate the wolves, and certainly not the wolves. Eventually, it's just hard because emotions run so high on it.
Yeah, because I think that's a really important thing to consider in reintroductions is you could have a majority in support, but even just having enough social support where you're thinking about, okay, from the animal's perspective, we're putting them into these environments where if they're not accepted, then ultimately they're perhaps just going to be hunted, shot, trapped. So, on both sides of things, you want the tolerance for, humans to coexist with them, but also, yeah, you don't want to put a bunch of animals in a situation where, okay, there's not enough tolerance and they're just going to struggle to adapt into this environment and then be eradicated. So, yeah, it's very complex. And wolves have been described as the most polarizing animal in the West. We're either so driven to conserve them and restore them or hunt them or completely eradicate them from the wild. What do you think it is about wolves that drives so much passion from people?
I gave a talk at our local community college a couple of years ago, and the title was, "What is it with wolves?" And that was exactly what I talked about. It wasn't my classic, here's how wolves made it back. It was more about the human dimension, going back to potential early relationships of more primitive hominids and wolves and domestication of dogs and the beginning of agriculture area and livestock developments. And this thing goes back tens of thousands of years, and just people aren't rational about wolves. It is mind-boggling to me because, every year lots of people are killed by mountain lions, black bears, grizzly bears, coyotes even get children, elk, vending machines. There's all kinds of stuff, but there's this kind of core fear of wolves in many people that turns into a hatred because they channel fear into hatred because they can't conceive of how to deal with it or control the situation. It's still very, very much a part of the human landscape.
Yeah, it's so interesting going into the field, like, I guess, knowing the most about wolves compared to any other predators, but also just being equipped with that knowledge. I feel the most at peace with encountering a wolf. I know how rare it would be. And I know that the chances of being attacked by a wolf, like I remember you talking about in your book about friends talking about being surrounded by wolves and being like, they could have killed me. And you're like, yes, exactly. They could have killed you, but they chose not to. And they have all of these kind of, I guess you could say, polite ways of telling you like, okay, you're in my space. You need to leave. I'm going to make that really clear to you. And it's very non-threatening way. So I feel like there's a lot of power behind knowledge too of people. When it's that fear, I know there's like different dimensions of fear of predators on the landscape. It could be direct competition with prey species. It could be killing livestock, but then also being in the wilderness and being afraid of these animals. I feel like in that situation, being equipped with that knowledge can be really powerful because then you just also feel more comfortable knowing what to do in those situations when you encounter an animal and more excited and allows for more appreciation too.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me to talk with people who have real deep-seated fears of wolves. It's like I have friends who have fears of heights or fears of spiders or whatever. It's not a rational thing, and you can listen to them. And if you try to ask why they're afraid, do they have some childhood experience? There usually isn't a real thing that's happened. Like my friend who's afraid of spiders, she wasn't bitten by a toxic spider when she was a kid. She just has this thing about spiders. And the same is true more or less with wolves. You and I have spent a lot of time out there among them, and hearing their howl is not terrifying. It's transcendental almost. It's them communicating. I feel I'm lucky to hear that. Getting bark howled at, it makes the hair on your neck stand up, but they're giving you a very clear message. It's like, you are too close to whatever it is that I am defending, be it a den, a rendezvous site, a kill. And you just leave. End of discussion. I respect their communication. And yeah, they have killed a few people too in recent times. Those were unusual situations, of course, but I don't worry about them. I mean, I'd be much more fearful of a mountain lion or a human being out in the woods than I would wolves or bears, for that matter.
And often those encounters, I mean, especially with, say, coyotes, for example, can all be traced back to human behavior too, where we're, either indirectly, unintentionally, or intentionally feeding these animals. And yeah. And so you've worked a lot with livestock owners and ranchers. And what have you learned about wolves and wolf management?
It's people management. It's not wolf management. That's an easy one. I guess what I learned, it took me a few years to figure this out, or a few decades, but when somebody's having challenges or illogical reasoning, I just learned to listen to them instead of trying to stop and interject my beliefs or my knowledge. I just listen to them till they're done. Let them unspool. And then you can start with, that's interesting. Boy, for what it's worth, in my experience, I've seen that, blah, blah, blah. And then just see how they respond. I don't tell them they're wrong. I mean, this is kind of the voice that I wrote my book in, basically, because I find if you're less combative, you generally are more able to open a conversation. And if you're able to open a conversation about wolves, you're able to open conservation of wolves. That's how I feel. And when I was young, I didn't have that feeling. It's like, well, how can anybody think that? And I just tell them, well, that's, here, that's wrong. Here's what it says. And I had to kind of figure that one out.
Yeah, I feel like that's something big that I've learned in the time that I've been studying wolves and I guess involved in wolf conservation issues. I mean, I'm very early in my career, but, even just the value of sitting back and listening to in so many different situations is so much more productive. People just want to be heard. And if you're not listening to them, that can really shut down all forms of communication. And wolves, like we said, are a very polarizing topic. And if people from all ends of the wolf spectrum can't talk to one another, it's really hard to resolve our issues and, get things done. And I think that the more conversations that we have amongst these different groups, we might be able to identify some overlapping values and hopefully find solutions that we can all support at some capacity.
So I'm just curious, when you're doing your work, I'm going to ask you, when you're doing your work, I have never been to the coast to explore the coastal wolves there. What are your concerns and your issues there as a young wolf researcher? I mean, you've read my experiences when I was a young wolf researcher. I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of my biggest concerns stems from studying a species that is so highly persecuted and not necessarily always accepted or welcomed on the land, especially when that land is shared with humans. But the project that I'm involved in lies within a management unit that currently does not have an open season on wolves. And that's not necessarily for the protection of the species. It's more that we just haven't had wolves in those areas for a long time. In the early 2000s or even prior to that, there was a concerted effort to reintroduce Roosevelt elk into those areas. And with that, and likely due to other factors as well, we're now seeing the return of wolves to many of those areas. Now, as a researcher and a biologist, I'm very curious to know where these wolves came from. As a conservationist who not only sees the importance of wolves being on the landscape, but also the importance of considering the well-beings of individuals that make up these populations, I do have concerns around tolerance and acceptance of these animals being there. And, also what my role is in terms of gathering information on them. You can't protect what you don't know, but I also don't want to be responsible for drawing attention to a wolf pack that leads to their demise. Yeah. So I don't know. There's also a lot of things that get me very excited about being a young wolf researcher. The wolf pack that we're following now, you kind of feel like a detective. Who's who, where are they traveling? What are they eating? Did they have a litter this year? Where are they raising their pups? And all of this is information that can ultimately be used to inform local conservation and stewardship strategies. We work closely with the First Nation in the area, and some of the information that we've gathered has led to mitigation measures being put in place to limit the disturbance of wolves, especially during those sensitive months when they're raising their pups. So those sort of things, seeing the information being directly applied to benefit the wildlife is really rewarding.
Thank you. I just was curious what things you really get excited about in your work.
With what cameras can tell us too, like the way that we've been tracking the pack is the photos that I showed you, you could probably see it's pretty evident that they all look quite different. So it allows us to track individuals, which is really interesting and exciting to kind of feels more intimate, I guess, than trying to count numbers and not really like getting to know individuals. And I think, as you said, with writing this book, the power of storytelling. So hopefully we can kind of piece together the stories of this pack. And I think that can be really inspiring for people to hear as well.
Yeah, and in the early years in Glacier, we went from 1 wolf to 2 to 8, and then the packs grew, and we saw them from the airplane. We flew quite a bit. We never saw them from the ground because it was dense lodgepole forest. But the color variation was really striking, and we had good tabs on individuals. This was way before there were such things as trail cameras and DNA. But I'm really, really pleased that nowadays people are using these non-invasive techniques. Trail cameras and DNA you don't need to radio color wolves anymore, really. That's old school. It's traumatic for all. And if you can get that same information, the only thing it's really good for, and I'm excited about it, is using GPS collars when an animal disperses and they go from, they had a wolf killed in Colorado this winter, and it turns out the DNA was from the wolves from the Midwest, not from Montana, Wyoming, it was from Minnesota or Wisconsin or something, to Colorado. And that was from DNA because they had the sample. It would have been really interesting if they'd had a GPS collar on that wolf to see where the heck that animal went, how it got there. And, now that DNA is available, it's a really good tool. But I do like the story of Pluie that was only available because of the GPS collar she was wearing. And it was very groundbreaking stuff where she went and ended up here in Montana.
Hey listeners, if you aren't familiar with the story of Pluie, she was a radio-colored wolf who, between 1991 and 1993, traveled over 100,000 square kilometers. That's an area 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park and 15 times that of Banff National Park. Pretty incredible. And during her incredible journey, she crossed more than 30 different political jurisdictions, showing us how effective conservation really needs to extend beyond national, provincial, and state borders and find ways to reduce human-created barriers to wildlife movement. Yeah, and I think that's a good point in terms of, depending on what the question is, like, how important is it that we collar these wolves? Pluie was such a good example and it has inspired so many conservation efforts and the dispersal and understanding how far these wolves travel. Because that's also something that I've noticed even in communications in terms of questions around how many wolves are in an area. And you see people are like, I think there's like 2 or 3 packs. I see tracks everywhere. And we're talking about like a pretty small area, like 100 square kilometers. And it's like, there's actually, likely a pack with a minimum of 6 individuals. They just can travel these really impressive lengths of time. And tons of tracks in one area might just mean, the wolves are very active in that area.
Yeah. And when we were doing our early years work, 200 square miles was not an uncommon territory size for one wolf pack. And you'd see tracks in all of the drainage from this one wolf pack. I'm really happy with the direction that wolf research is going. It's really exciting information. It's like what you guys are getting. It's amazing.
Yeah. And have you worked more in recent years with kind of state fish and wildlife departments in terms of like, I guess, with all these advances in technology and how we approach studying wolves?
Wolf populations are managed by each individual state now, and their budgets are not great. If you can get a university person on board, like in Idaho, Dave Osband working out of University of Idaho, I think he's leader of the Cooperative Research Unit. He's got amazing graduate students doing brilliant research, and now they're looking at dynamics of packs and potential impacts of wolves by human harvest. Are there impacts? If so, what? Because it's university effort. But here in Montana, I worked for the state Fish, Wildlife, and Parks from 2016 till my retirement on January 1st of 2020. And it was collar and faller, as we used to say. But the whole thing was we put radio collars on wolves. You'd spend many, many months all summer, beating up equipment, and all of your office time, all of your time was absorbed trying to get a handful of collars out. And then come hunting season September, they'd all be shot. And part of that was due to an archaic law made by the legislature, was pushed forward by the livestock growers, that all wolf packs in the state of Montana that may come into contact with livestock have to have a collar in them. That's every pack in the state of Montana, except for one pack up in the northwest corner of Glacier Park. And it's impossible. It's impossible. So the law should go away, and then they can actually get better data on wolf population dynamics, because in Montana every year, approximately 300 wolves are available, brought in for tagging, that are shot or trapped, 250 to 300 every year. It's a completely random sample all over the state. Hunters bring the samples to you. You don't have to invest any time. And you could get the DNA from these. And right now, the different wolf biologists working for the state are using trail cameras a lot. But it could be a more thorough sample size. And if you wanted to target specific packs, you could follow the model they use in Idaho, where they go into the rendezvous sites, which are easy to determine from aerial photos and GIS information, collect scats, and you could have a sample from almost every wolf pack. Between the killing and the ground targeted efforts by state employees, why wouldn't you do that? And you can't have made any given time, you might have 25 wolves on the air. That drops down. It's such a tiny fraction, and you get essentially no information except for, well, there's a dot there where they were, and there's a dot there where they are now.
Yeah, it seems like a win-win for their low budget and wildlife welfare as well. Like, we're all everyone's winning.
Yeah, and I proposed these research studies, and I used the data from other places. They're doing this in Europe right now. They're doing it in Idaho. They're doing it in other states. But Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is stuck with that old law that they have to radio collar wolves. And so until some of the leadership changes, they can't do it. And it would be more cost-effective use of dollars as well to just stop radio collaring wolves and to do these other non-invasive methods that give you more data for less investment of resources.
As technology has advanced, even with collaring, we can now sit at our desks and look at where these wolves are, versus back in the day, you would be on the landscape. And that's what I think about with collecting scat and checking cameras. It also allows us more of an intimate knowledge, and working with locals, First Nations on the ground, doing the field work. So we're getting more of a holistic view of the history of these wolf populations, but also just what the landscape looks like from the ground. And was that kind of your experience too? Because I know, just from hearing your stories, you really have an intimate knowledge of the landscape, not only for tracking the wolves, but also safety and all of this.
So later in my career, this last 4 years with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, I put out VHF, the old traditional collars where you have to be out finding them, and as well as GPS collars. And I used both tools, and so I could come in the morning and turn on my computer, set up my cup of tea and a donut or something, and look at where my wolves were on the screen, where they had moved. But it's dots. That's all the information you have. We had the budget to fly one flight per year. If we were really wealthy, 2 flights a year to try and get a visual and see how many animals were in the pack. And then you have hunter-harvest surveys at the end of the year. There was a lot of information that kind of slipped through the cracks, but it met minimum standards as required through state management and the ESA. So that's how it is. It's not Yellowstone, which is such an amazing place and such a great research opportunity. They've got millions of dollars pouring in, and people and tourists and visitors reporting what they see, and graduate research projects from all over the country, all over, in Canada. It's a great research facility and lots of interactive research going on. Glacier Park, you got a population of wolves that nobody can ever see. It doesn't draw tourists. There's no money to come to Glacier and watch wolves because you're not going to see them. You might get lucky to see a scatter or a track. It's a different world.
What they can learn in Yellowstone is really, truly amazing. Like, I think of, for one of the webinar series that we did, Wolf School, I got to interview Rick McIntyre, one of the wolf watchers, and just like the amount of information that they have on these packs to be able to tell those kind of stories is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, and it's highly coordinated. I mean, Rick was kind of Papa Wolf there in terms of coordinating all the sightings. And he knows, there's nobody who knows the wolves better than Rick did at his, height of his career there. But he's got how many people reporting to him and taking photos, and a wolf can't cross a highway without somebody seeing it there, So no, it's really amazing. I go to Yellowstone at least twice a year, every year, and so enjoy the experience.
Well, speaking of stories of wolves, there's a lot of prominent stories in your book that focus on female wolves. And it's pretty incredible what we can learn from their individual journeys. Is there a particular wolf whose story stands out to you most?
People like the story about Kishnina because she was the first, but we weren't in touch with her very long before her radio collar failed. And I would say the story of Phyllis, I wrote a chapter on her. That wolf stands out in that I had a lot of field time pursuing her, following her, tracking her. I was never able to recapture her. She was caught the first time in a grizzly bear snare accidentally. We knew her fate from the time she was about 2. She might have been 3 when Bruce caught her and put the radio collar on. She was lactating. She'd had her first litter until she died at about age 11 up in southwestern Alberta. And she was basically kind of known to us off and on through those years. In that chapter, I report through stories about Phyllis, and I involve the reader in skiing with me, traveling with me, setting traps with me, imagining scenarios that Phyllis encountered, and then the times I did see Phyllis. Some of them are incredibly special. She basically came up to my cabin one day, and that was mind-blowing. Through her dispersal up, her deposure as the breeding female, like I'm talking about your old female there with the gray muzzle, she lost her status as the breeding female, was replaced by a younger, stronger female. And after that point in time, she continued to hang around the Flathead, and she bred one year, but the wolves, her packmates didn't stay with her, and she basically lost her pups, and then most of the pups were shot that fall, and she was alone. And she ended up kind of lone and dispersed up to Alberta, and she was old. And she ended up at this minimum security prisoner camp, staffed by, and most of the inmates were what we call Native American, but First Nations. And I went up, and then she ended up being shot by a guide outfitter up there who likes to hunt predators, especially mountain lions. But all 3 places, viewpoints are told in that chapter. My viewpoint, the First Nations camp manager who developed a relationship with Phyllis as an old wolf and basically extended her life considerably. And then the hunter who took her life. I tell the 3 viewpoints, and I don't tell my readers, I don't make any judgment on whose viewpoint is more valuable. But she was a powerful wolf in my world.
Yeah. And did you say she was a black wolf that turned completely white at the end of her life?
No, she was unusual in that when she was captured the first time at about age 2, maybe 3, she was already very, very creamy white, very unusual. But I did report on another wolf who was one of her pups, who was captured as a pup at 5 months, black as a little bear cub, And by the time she died old, very, very few wolves die old. These are two. She was pure white. And we had her on the air for another 11 years. And she went from black to black with some silver grizzling to a beautiful smoky charcoal silver gray, basically to white. And we saw her often. And we got photos of her through those various color phases.
Wow. And just to put into context for listeners, saying like an 11-year-old wolf is really old, what is kind of the average lifespan of a wolf in the wild?
So they looked at wolf lifespans in Minnesota and some of the Canadian parks and Yellowstone and our work in Montana. And an average wolf lifespan is about 3.4 years from the time it's first seen emerging from the den, because some pups die before that when they're just a couple of weeks old, till it dies. Wolves, on average, do not live very long. They have a lot of hardships in their life. They have to risk being killed every time they eat. Catching a fleeing deer, bison, elk, whatever, you get stomped, you can get drowned. When they trespass or seeking new home ranges, they get killed by resident wolves. It's a difficult life. And most wolves, I would guess, if you were to x-ray dead wolves, they'd all have broken bone injuries they're recovering from. I would say most female wolves do not produce pups in their life. I'm going to have to look up a paper on that. I'm curious now, but not every female in the pack breeds, and most female wolves at 3.5 have only had really one good year of reproduction. They aren't even fertile till they're 2. So most females that are born probably do not reproduce. It's not like coyotes or humans.
Yeah, and that stage of life of dispersal too, I imagine. I mean, that's a tough life, trying to find new territory, find a mate, feed yourself. It makes me think a lot about the alpha female that Rick wrote about. I think she was 06, and how she lived a lot, like her first 4 or 5 years by herself, and took down, I don't know if it was an elk by herself, but some phenomenal stories of just what you wouldn't normally see. Just, you know, why wolves usually live in packs. Takes a lot to take down those animals. And we've seen on the cameras, like those kind of injuries are pretty evident, but it's also very impressive that they're still going. Like you see them, there's evidence that they've taken a deer or an elk, and you can see them bringing food back and forth, but they're also limping. And then, you know, a few weeks later, they seem all right, but it's a tough life.
They're tough, but yeah, elements are tougher.
Are there any stories in your book, or any stories that you left out from your book that are worth sharing?
A few hundred.
A few hundred.
We were working on trying to develop a new way to catch wolves, not using traps. We were trying to learn from the researchers up in Denali National Park, where they were using walking neck snares on wolves in the winter months around kills, and the wolves would step through the snares, and the neck snare would lock, and they wouldn't strangle, and they would check them often, and they could go in and catch these wolves without having the trauma of holding them by their paw and risking all those damages. So we had a trapper was going to fly down from John Birch from Alaska, from the Denali Project. And my pilot, Dave Horner, and I were going to go out and pre-bait a place with carcasses so we could lure the wolves in there, where we could ski or snowshoe in with capture equipment in British Columbia. And it was March, and I was all along the roadside, and I found a freshly killed car-struck deer on the road shoulder in Kalispell, late March, sunny, warm spring day, 55, 60 degrees, big fat doe. And I picked her up and I put her in my pickup. Said, Dave, I got a fresh one. Let's go fly and dump this deer out for John's trip here, bait these wolves in so they get used to it. So we took this deer at 3,000 feet, 100,000 meters elevation, very swollen, very expanded from the gases in her stomach, put her in the airplane on a tarp, and we went up and up and up and up and flew over the mountains up into British Columbia. And as you go up, the air pressure gets less, and pretty soon every orifice of this deer was leaking really stinky fluids. And it's like, oh my God, and this deer is about to blow up. He says, we got to dump this deer out real quick. So he says, I'm going to spin and I'm going to circle on the wing, and you pull that deer out and open the door and pull her out. And it would have been easier at 3,000 feet, but up at 9,000 feet. And this deer was enormous. He lowers me down to 8,000 feet, and I open the door, and I'm trying to hold the door open. It's just a little, 2 or 4 seat airplane. I'm trying to hold the door open, and I'm trying to pull the deer out of the back seat from the floor and get it in the opening, but her legs are stuck out at like 90-degree angles because her belly's all swollen. And I'm hanging out, basically, I'm hanging out of the airplane with one foot on the strut outside, and I'm tugging on the steer, and Dave is hanging onto my belt on the waist of my pants because I'm outside of the airplane. And I finally pull, and I get the deer out, and I jump back in, and it was like a cartoon. We're up in the air, and we're looking out of the airplane, looking for this deer to see where it landed. We're going to mark it on the airplane so we can get back, and it's spinning down through the air. It hits the trees and hits the ground, and it just explodes.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't put that in the book, but I think you asked.
Yeah.
I think it's a funny story.
I mean, I think those are things that people never imagine you have to do in the field.
Yeah, no, I've got hundreds of stories of I only put a handful in the book to illustrate points.
Yeah. That makes me think of, I mean, lucky that you didn't go out the door with the deer.
I know.
Are there any, and I know you talk about this, I mean, there's some stories that you share in the book that I'm like, wow, like, because when I was reading it, I was doing salmon surveys. So I was in waders and it was stormy. So there was like pretty high flow, but I'm also reading these stories of you like crossing these like extremely cold rivers, talking about how high they are. Were there any like near-death experiences or just experiences that you're like, whoa, that was a close one?
I know I put the one in the book about the one time where there was a really warm spring day and the river had come up sufficiently that we just got across the river wading and got into Glacier Park and then put our skis on and left our waders on the shore. And then we came back, the water had come up just a few inches, but I'm pretty light. And as I put my waders back on and started to wade with my skis on my back and I had my poles, my feet were just barely making contact with the stones. And eventually I started to float down the river and I began to tip over with my backpack on. And as I was going under, I had, luckily my colleague Pat was with me and he caught me by the back of my backpack and pulled me up out of the water just as my hair was going in. My waders filled with water, and yeah, he pulled me up out of the water, and I was grateful that I had company that day because most days when you're wading the river, you're alone. That was a day where I could have bit the bullet. As it turned out, it was a sunny, warm spring day, and we were on our way back to the pickup, and he pulls me out. He says, "Are you okay?" And I said, yes. Because I couldn't breathe. And then we both started to laugh. And he says, "Do you want to go back and dump the waters out of your waders?" Like, no. We just continued to cross. And then I dumped the water out and I had dry clothes in the car. But it became funny because I had survived it. But we never lost anybody. And we had all these students from all over the country, volunteer technicians, and people were young and full of passion and ambition and immortal. And we never had anybody get seriously hurt, seriously lost, or injured.
Yeah. And I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when you first started studying wolves, there were very few women field biologists. What were some of the biggest challenges or obstacles you had to face as a woman in the field during that time?
I got asked that question a lot before I wrote the book, and I actually had to pause and think, well, I don't know. I mean, I just did my job because that's who I am. And there was no Me Too movement, and there wasn't Title IX, and there wasn't sexual harassment stuff. And it's just sort of like when things would come up, I just put my head down and I push harder. And if an obstacle came up in front of me, I would put on my climbing spikes and climb over it, around it, go through it. And I just did. And I didn't really think about it. But then when people asked me that a lot, and I thought, well, obviously other people think about it. And then when I wrote the book, in a couple of chapters, I talk about some specific incidents where my gender and my age, being a bit naive perhaps, do come into play. But I really did not think about it on a day-to-day basis, or I never would have gone out there and done what I did. I was naive and full of ambition and immortal, and I could do anything.
Maybe that's a gift at that time too because I think we hear so many stories of things that happen, and I think it puts a lot of fear in people because how common it is. And so being naive can have its benefits, but also being like trusting your gut and being prepared as well.
So I trust my gut. I trust my instincts. My radar detectors just don't fail me. And I like another story. I can remember one evening I was in my cabin with the dogs. I was a long way from anything or anybody. It was a time when there weren't other volunteers up. I believe it was the winter. I can't remember the month, but I just remember being in my cabin and I was thinking about going outside, use the outhouse for the last time. It was dark. It was late. And I had this very foreboding feeling that there was something outside that was dangerous. And I never had that happen. And I mean, I've been out in the woods a lot with a lot of scary stuff. And like my hair and my neck's going up just telling you this story. And I listened to that. Man, I got an old ice cream pail or something and, peed there for the night. I didn't go out until it was daylight. And I don't know what it was. I listened to my gut, as you say, and it was gone the next day. And I sometimes wonder parts of our human brain we don't ever use, but those primordial detection zones are still there. And I don't know if I could smell and not register that there was a human outside or a bear. I mean, it didn't have bears coming up to my cabin. I don't know what it was, but I just listened to it and I couldn't tell you if it was real or not, but I didn't challenge it. Don't know what it was. I just listen. I listen to my instincts. My instincts are pretty good. And if my dogs alert me that there's something, I generally listen to their instincts too, because they were born and raised there. I mean, they're not city dogs, and if they're worried, then I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think studying wildlife in general, we kind of are tapping into trying to understand all, like moving through the environment, listening for things. So it prepares us in a certain way.
Yeah, and there are also beautiful moments. I can recall another night where it was I had to go to the outhouse. It was 10 or 11 at night. It was November and it was storming and the wind was howling and the snow was coming in kind of horizontally. And I went outside with a bright flashlight to go to the outhouse. And I stepped outside of my little cabin and the window lights, I had the Coleman lanterns and the propane lights on in the cabin. And I heard this call and I stopped. And above the wind, I could hear it was snow geese. And they were flying over. And I had never heard snow geese over. And I lived very close to the Continental Divide. And they were flying. And I stood there quietly. And they were circling around the meadow that I lived in, and they were flying around in this storm with this snow, and it was haunting. And as I had my light, and they got sounding closer, and I put my light up to the sky, and I could see their white underbellies and wings, and I went, "Oh my God, they're lost, and they're coming to my light." So I shut my light off, and I went inside my cabin, and I shut all the lights off, and I sat inside wondering, what are they going to do? Are they going to try and crash land in a snowstorm in my meadow? It's open. Are they going to try and fly up over the Continental Divide in this storm to try and get to another place of safety? Are they going to perish? I just think, and this happens all the time with wildlife. We aren't aware of it. And that night it was so poignant, and it still haunts me, the sounds. I heard snow geese last week when I was on the Rocky Mountain front, and it's so beautiful. And then they come through Montana. They come through tens of thousands, 100,000. I've been over to Freeze Out Lake on the Rocky Mountain front in the springtime, and counts vary from 30,000 to 100,000 geese, all in the same place at the same time. And when they take off, it's deafening. You can't talk. You couldn't hear a car honk, probably. It's beautiful, and it's a free performance by nature. Just go look for the stuff. It's out there.
Yeah. It makes me think of, so I live in the city in Vancouver, so this is a very urban story, but the crows will like migrate to Burnaby every day. So I've been sitting, like I can see the mountains. I live in an apartment, but I can see the mountains, and every day at a certain time, you'll just see like hundreds, thousands of them just like in their like daily migration. It's pretty fascinating.
And they They have to feed, avoid predators, avoid crashing into windows. And they do it every day without any set of rules. They have to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I would love to talk a little bit about, you've worked in Canada as well in multiple national parks, Banff, Yoho, Kootenays, Waterton, Jasper. And is that where you met Paul Paquette?
I met Paul at an Edmonton conference, and he invited me up to come up and collar some wolves in Banff. And then he hooked me up with Kootenay, Yoho, Waterton, and John Weaver was doing his PhD on some wolves up in Jasper. So I went up and tried to catch wolves for him too. But that's how I met Paul. And he was in his heyday there in the Canadian park system. And what an amazing opportunity. Of course, Paul's an amazing man and researcher too. And yeah, we've stayed in touch over the years.
Yeah, he's an amazing mentor to myself. And I mean, with this series as well, with so many of the women all the women that we are talking with, Paul's had some kind of impact on their lives. So
he definitely did. And I remember when I was up trapping in the backcountry of Banff, I had a big shaggy dog named Max, and he had a husky mix named Sheba. And so he offered to take care of Max while I was up in the backcountry of Banff. I said, okay, thanks. I said, just don't spoil her. He says, no, I won't spoil her. And when I got back from my backcountry trapping a week or whatever, I come to the house and I walk in the door, and there he is on his couch with Sheba on the couch on one side, Max on the couch on the other side, and he had a bowl of ice cream, and he was spoon feeding one to one dog, spoon feeding to the other dog. And I said, well, I'm glad you didn't spoil my dog while I was gone. And yeah, no, Paul and I were very, very good friends. I just admire the hell out of him. He's a great guy. Anyway, he mentored me a lot about wolves and other things, and just a brilliant naturalist as well as a scientist and ecologist.
Yeah, he definitely has a way of mentoring where he just makes you feel like you can do anything. I'd say is the best way to sum it up.
Yes, and he doesn't have gender biases, which many carnivore researchers, men, do.
Okay, well, I have just a few more questions that I would love to ask you. What has working with wolves taught you about yourself?
Well, two things I would say. I've never been asked that, actually. I would say, number one, I've become a better observer. I'm more aware using not my eyes, using my sense of smell and touch and intuition, like wild animals. And the second thing is that life will work better if you're a pack member. I tend to have been a loner my whole life, and I found working with colleagues, research team, the general public, that we are a social species, and we can do best if we communicate better with one another and work cooperatively.
I love that answer and very much agree. Is there any contribution to wolf science that you are most proud of?
I think if I had to pick one thing in terms of the greatest impact on scientific contribution to wolves, I think it's my memoir, A Woman Among Wolves, because it will reach potentially millions of people. I mean, it's very well read. It's an Amazon bestseller, and it's a lot of people will read this that will never, ever read a scientific article or read a type of magazine that's very pro-wolf or something that me might read an article in. It opens up new thought patterns, I hope, by reading this book. And so I feel kind of at my new career is this book and reaching the public with accessible language and stories and science. While I was working on this book, we also did the largest and most current review of all species, subspecies, races of wolves in North America. I was a senior author with seven other authors spreading from the Arctic to Mexico. And it's a big revision of the 1987 classic on the fur bearer management carnivores in North America that Lou Carbon wrote the wolf chapter way back then. I think it was 25 pages or something. Well, this so much has happened since that was written in 1987, pre-reintroduction, pre-DNA, pre-GPS satellite collars. The chapter became a book in itself, and it's available online. That took 4 years with all these co-authors to whip into shape. The Woman Among Wolves took me 1 year to write the rough draft from start to finish, and then another year of editing and revising and stuff. And it was the technical chapter was using my brain and resources with all these professionals that were so amazing to work with. A Woman Among Wolves was using my heart and my brain to tone down the language to reach everybody. And it was a nice juxtaposition of two different challenges that kind of made me whole.
Yeah. Did you want to read an excerpt from your book?
Oh, golly, I could. Hang on, just give me 10 seconds. I'll read the very first paragraph on page 1 in my introduction, because that sort of sets the language and the pace for how the book goes. My pickup banged and rattled along the potholed inside road in the northwest corner of Glacier National Park. Boxes of wolf traps and jars of bait slid across the truck bed. I was in a hurry, my mind focused on the wolf caught in a trap somewhere ahead in the lodgepole pine forest. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed motion in my rearview mirror. I looked up to catch the glassy reflection of vivid yellow eyes framed by a wolf's black face looking over my shoulder from the back seat. How did I get here? That's opening of the book.
That's great.
So, and then I go ahead and tell people how I got there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Diane, it's been so wonderful to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, thank you. It's been fun. You've asked some different questions, which is refreshing for me and give me a lot of food for thought. And I'm going to be looking forward to an invite, and you can come down to Yellowstone. I swear we have to do that.
Well, thank you all so much for listening. Tune in next time to hear more conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger. As a former professional cross-country skier and elite marathon mountain runner, Gudrun's exceptional skills made her uniquely suited to track the elusive coastal wolves in British Columbia, Canada. In her role as a field biologist, she was pivotal in helping both scientists and local communities collect vital data, shedding light on the ecology and genetics of wolves on BC's Central Coast and later in the Rocky Mountains of Alberta. Beyond her contributions to wolf conservation, Gudrun was a mother, friend, and a source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Documented in films such as A Woman Among Wolves and Running with Wolves, Gudrun's journey was one of passion, determination, and resilience, revealing the true healing power of nature. You can find links to these documentaries in the episode's show notes.
Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.